Picture this, it is 1942. The Japanese military has just bombed Darwin. Australia is under direct threat for the first time in its modern history. And who does Australia call? Not Britain, not the Commonwealth, they call Washington. They pivot south to the one power that can actually save them. That moment created a bond deeper than treaties, deeper than trade deals, a bond built on blood, on fear, on the understanding that Australia and America are each other's ultimate backstop in the Pacific. That bond has been held for 80 years, until now. Because this week, for the first time in living memory, Australia made a choice. And it didn't choose Washington. It chose Ottawa. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney will travel to Canberra in March to deliver a historic address to the Australian Parliament. Not a side meeting, not a press conference, a full address to Parliament, an honor so rare, so loaded with diplomatic signals that you could count on one hand the number of foreign leaders who have ever been given it. And here is what you have to understand. The last time a foreign leader delivered that kind of address, it was an American president. Trump tried to corner Canada. He tried to isolate Carney. He called him ungrateful, threatened him with tariffs, and publicly told him on the world stage, Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. Carney didn't fire back. He didn't go on television and rage. He picked up the phone and called Canberra, and Canberra said yes. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why this moment matters more than almost anything else happening in geopolitics right now. I'm going to walk you through the receipts, the hard data, the real numbers, the documented reactions that prove this isn't just a diplomatic visit. This is a structural realignment of the English-speaking world. I'm going to show you what George Conway, a conservative lawyer who knows Trump better than almost anyone alive, says this means for American power. And I'm going to tell you why this specific move, made by two countries most Americans barely think about, could change the price of everything you buy. You are watching history being made in real time, and most people have no idea it's happening. For the better part of a century, Western alliance relationships in the Pacific rested on a hierarchy so stable it barely required articulation. The United States sat at the center, not simply because it was the largest economy, but because it was, for most of that period, the most reliable partner. Reliability in international relations is worth more than raw power. Countries build their infrastructure, their defense posture, and their trade architecture around it. Australia built its entire post-war security framework on that reliability. It hosts American military installations at Pine Gap. It is one of 5 founding members of Five Eyes intelligence sharing. It is the A in AUKUS, the nuclear submarine pact that took years of negotiation and billions of dollars before a single keel had been laid. These are not casual arrangements. They represent decades of interlocking decisions, each one deepening Australia's integration with American strategic interests. All built on the assumption that Washington would remain a predictable, institutionally stable partner. What began shifting that assumption was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow accumulation of signals. The tariff announcements of early 2025 were the most visible. When the White House imposed sweeping trade penalties on allied economies, the immediate analysis focused on trade flows and supply chain disruption. But the more important consequence was not economic, it was reputational. Allies were watching the world's largest economy using its market access as a weapon against the countries it had spent 80 years asking to trust it. Australia watched carefully, and it started doing the math. The economic relationship between Australia and the United States is not, in gross terms, Australia's most critical bilateral relationship. Its largest trading partner is China. Its fastest growing relationships are in Southeast Asia. What this means is that Australia has always had more economic flexibility than Canada when it comes to diversifying away from the United States. It could observe the deteriorating Canada-US dynamics from a position of more distance, and what it observed over 2025 was instructive. Canada's response to American tariff pressure did not follow the pattern the White House appeared to expect. Nearly 75% of Canadian exports flow south. The dependency is structural. By any conventional analysis, Canada should have been vulnerable. Instead, the Carney government treated the tariff pressure as a strategic catalyst rather than a crisis. Within 6 months of taking office, Canada concluded 12 new trade agreements across 4 continents. It deepened energy partnerships with Japan and South Korea. It signed a bilateral critical minerals cooperation agreement with Australia in October 2025, aligning resource supply chains across uranium, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals. It secured a $50 billion UAE investment commitment into Canadian infrastructure. Each of these moves, taken individually, could be characterized as routine diplomacy. Taken together, they represented something more: a systematic reduction of Canada's dependence on a single trading relationship that had become unpredictable, and the construction of a parallel economic architecture that could function independently of American approval. Australia was watching this unfold, and what it saw was competence, the quiet, structural kind that reshapes the underlying conditions of global trade in ways that outlast any individual political cycle. To understand why the Australia-Canada alignment carries the weight it does, you need to understand the economic geography of critical minerals. The global economy is undergoing a transition whose physical requirements are concentrated in a small number of materials. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, rare earths, and potash are the specific inputs required to build batteries, generate nuclear power, manufacture semiconductors, and produce fertilizer. The countries that control access to these materials, not just extraction, but processing and refinement, hold structural leverage that operates independently of military power. China currently controls approximately 70% of global rare earth mining and close to 90% of rare earth processing. This has been a recognized vulnerability for Western economies for over a decade. The problem has been that diversification requires not just new mining operations but processing infrastructure, which takes longer still. Canada and Australia, taken together, represent the most realistic alternative to Chinese dominance. Australia holds the world's largest identified uranium reserves and is the 3rd largest lithium producer. Canada is among the top producers of uranium, cobalt, and nickel, and is the 3rd largest producer of potash. Both have mature mining industries, transparent regulatory frameworks, and established export infrastructure. And critically, both are now moving toward aligning those supply chains in a way that creates joint processing capacity. What the Carney government recognized, and what the October Agreement formalized, was that critical minerals are not simply an economic asset. They are a geopolitical instrument. The October Pact was about establishing the institutional framework that would allow Canada and Australia to present themselves collectively as the reliable democratic alternative to Chinese supply chain dominance. When Carney's parliamentary visit was announced, Albanese specifically referenced the October Agreement. He mentioned critical minerals. He used the language of middle power cooperation. These were not decorative phrases. They pointed to a concrete economic architecture whose significance extended well beyond the bilateral relationship itself. AUKUS occupies an unusual position in this story because it represents the point where Australia's security interests and economic interests most directly intersect, and where the signals coming out of the Carney visit become difficult for Washington to interpret as anything other than a hedge. AUKUS, announced in 2021, committed Australia to acquiring nuclear-powered submarines with American and British assistance. The financial commitment is enormous. The strategic commitment is deeper still, because nuclear propulsion technology is among the most closely guarded in American defense exports. What has complicated this picture is the current administration's behavior toward the agreement. AUKUS has been placed under a defense spending review. Australian officials have been informed that continued American support is contingent on Australia meeting an increased defense spending threshold. Reportedly, 3% of GDP, well above current commitments. When Albanese's office announced the Carney visit, it made no mention of AUKUS. It made no mention of the United States. In diplomatic communication, absences are rarely accidental. The omission signaled that Australia had options, and that its relationship with the United States, while important, was not the only relationship available to it. That is not a signal Australia would have embedded in a public statement 5 years ago. The fact that it did so now, in the context of an invitation to a prime minister who had just been publicly confronted by the American president at Davos, reflected a calculation that the costs of continued deference had begun to exceed the costs of visible independence. The immediate trigger for Albanese's announcement was a sequence at the World Economic Forum in Davos in late January 2026. The timing, 3 days between Carney's speech and the Australian announcement, was not coincidental. Carney addressed the forum on January 22nd. He argued that the rules-based international order was under serious stress. He used the word rupture, a deliberate choice, carrying the implication of something already broken. He argued that middle power countries needed to act collectively, and he was specific about what he meant by economic coercion, the use of market access and trade policy as instruments of political pressure by large economies against smaller ones. He did not name the United States. He did not need to. The response from Washington came 2 days later. At the same forum, the American president said, "I watched your prime minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." The phrase "Canada lives because of the United States" treats sovereign nations as dependencies whose continued existence is conditional on American goodwill, rather than as independent actors whose partnership is a choice. The distinction matters, because the second framing implies partners can recalculate and make different choices. Carney's response, delivered in Ottawa, was measured. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our home. This is our own country. The choice is up to us. 3 days later, Albanese appeared on ABC's Insiders and confirmed Carney's parliamentary visit. The phrase he used, "my friend Mark Carney," was not diplomatic boilerplate. It was a public alignment, made in full awareness of the Davos exchange. Washington noticed, and the absence of any prior consultation with the White House indicated that Australia had made a deliberate decision to act without seeking American approval. George Conway's perspective carries weight not because he occupies a formal position, but because of where he comes from. Conway is a Harvard-educated conservative lawyer who spent decades at the intersection of elite Republican legal and political circles. He was married to Kellyanne Conway, who managed the 2016 Trump campaign. He was offered a senior position in the Trump Justice Department. His trajectory placed him firmly within the institutional Republican establishment. What shifted Conway's positioning was not an ideological conversion, but an analytical one. What he observed and documented in his George Conway Explains series on the Bulwark was a systematic dismantling of the institutional norms and alliance relationships he understood to be the foundations of American strategic power. His critique is structural. He argues that treating allied relationships as transactions, extracting maximum value at each interaction rather than maintaining long-term credibility, is self-defeating by its own logic. The Australia-Canada dynamic illustrates this precisely. A relationship like AUKUS derives its value from the certainty that both parties will honor commitments over a long time horizon. Nuclear technology transfers, joint basing agreements, integrated command structures, none work on a transactional basis. They require trust built through consistent behavior over years. The moment one party treats the relationship as leverage, conditioning commitments on additional concessions, it introduces a discount rate into the other party's calculation. The partner begins asking not, "How much is this worth?" but "How long will this be reliable?" And when that question becomes uncertain, the rational response is to hedge. That is what Australia has been doing, with the quiet, incremental logic of a government that recognized a change in its operating environment and is adjusting accordingly. Conway's point is that this kind of hedging, once begun, is very difficult to reverse. The October Critical Minerals Pact, the parliamentary invitation, the deepening relationships with Japan, South Korea, the UAE, these are institutional commitments that have their own momentum. Every new agreement adds a constituency with an interest in maintaining it. The architecture, once built, tends to persist. Any analysis of what Australia was responding to has to reckon with the Lowy Institute's annual polling on Australian attitudes toward major world powers. The poll is methodologically rigorous, nationally representative, and has been conducted consistently for 21 years. The 2025-2026 results recorded the largest single-year decline in trust in the United States in the poll's history. Australian trust in the US dropped by 20 points in 12 months, from 56% to 36%. That figure represented the lowest level ever recorded across 2 decades of polling. By the same survey, 64% of Australians, nearly 2 in 3, reported little or no trust in the United States to act responsibly. These numbers constrain the political options available to the Australian government. An elected leader cannot maintain an unconditional alliance posture with a foreign government that 2 in 3 constituents view with distrust. When trust erodes to this degree, the political cost of being seen to defer to Washington rises substantially. The specific issues driving the distrust are revealing. 89% of Australians disapproved of American attempts to acquire Greenland. 81% disapproved of the use of tariffs against allies. The disapproval is behavioral, not ideological. Australians are not saying they reject the alliance. They are saying that specific things the United States has been doing are inconsistent with how a reliable partner behaves. Albanese's decision to announce the Carney visit on ABC's Insiders, a political affairs show, rather than through a formal diplomatic statement, was itself significant. He was making an announcement he was confident his audience would understand and support. It was a prime minister speaking to his own voters, signaling alignment with a foreign leader seen, in Australian public opinion, as a more recognizable kind of partner. The Australia-Canada alignment does not exist in isolation. It is one node in a broader pattern of institutional adjustment that allied governments have been undertaking in response to the same underlying shift in the American policy environment. European governments have been accelerating defense spending and integration, not primarily because they were persuaded by American pressure, but because they concluded the American security guarantee had become conditional in ways that made it imprudent to rely on without parallel indigenous capacity. Japan and South Korea have been deepening bilateral security cooperation and relationships with Australian and Canadian resource suppliers. India has been cultivating relationships simultaneously with the United States, Russia, the EU, and Canada, a deliberate multi-alignment strategy. What these adjustments share is a common logic. The post-war hub-and-spoke model of American-led alliances is being supplemented, and in some areas replaced, by a more distributed network in which allies maintain stronger lateral connections to each other. From a systems perspective, a more interconnected network is structurally more resilient. The problem, from Washington's perspective, is that a more distributed network is one in which the center has less control. The Canberra visit, when it happens in March, will produce documentation, joint statements, commitments on critical minerals processing, possibly a framework for defense industrial cooperation. But the more significant output will be structural rather than documentary. It will be the institutional deepening of a relationship that has been developing quietly for several years, and the public consolidation of a posture by both Australia and Canada of middle power independence from the most disruptive pressures currently operating in the international system. For the United States, the implications are neither catastrophic nor trivial. The alliance relationships remain. The intelligence sharing continues. The defense commitments persist. But the operating assumption on which those relationships were built, that allied countries would defer to American preferences because they had no viable alternative, is no longer accurate. Canada has demonstrated that alternatives exist and can be built quickly by a competent government with clear strategic direction. Australia has demonstrated that the political will to pursue those alternatives, even at the cost of friction with Washington, is present when domestic conditions support it. The question is not whether the United States remains the world's most powerful economy or most capable military force. It demonstrably does. The question is whether power, in the current environment, translates into the kind of influence that makes allied countries organize their supply chains, defense procurement, and diplomatic calendars around American preferences. In the Pacific, in early 2026, the answer to that question is becoming more complicated than it has been at any point in the post-war period. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, but in the quiet, structural, calendar entry kind of way that tends to matter most over time. Mark Carney is flying to Canberra in March. Anthony Albanese will introduce him to Parliament as a friend. And in the background of that formal, procedurally unremarkable event, an 80-year architecture is doing what architectures do when the ground beneath them shifts. It is adjusting. The Canberra visit is worth watching, not because it will be dramatic, but because the deals signed in quiet rooms tend to be the ones that endure. Let me know in the comments what you make of the middle power strategy Carney is building. If you want to follow the Canberra announcements in March and the broader network being assembled, subscribe. This story is moving on a timeline the daily news cycle won't track. Carney didn't fire back. He didn't go on television and rage. He picked up the phone and called Canberra, and Canberra said yes. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why this moment matters more than almost anything else happening in geopolitics right now. I'm going to walk you through the receipts, the hard data, the real numbers, the documented reactions that prove this isn't just a diplomatic visit. This is a structural realignment of the English-speaking world. I'm going to show you what George Conway, a conservative lawyer who knows Trump better than almost anyone alive, says this means for American power. And I'm going to tell you why this specific move, made by two countries most Americans barely think about, could change the price of everything you buy. You are watching history being made in real time, and most people have no idea it's happening.